Good evening. I'm Lena Moore, and I serve as Deputy Executive Director of the Clinton Foundation, and it is my honor to welcome you here tonight and to thank you all for joining us. We realize you have other options, but you chose to join us tonight, and we truly appreciate it. Tonight's program is in conjunction with our current temporary exhibit. It's called Mandela, The Journey to Ubuntu, and it captures President Nelson Mandela's life through the camera lens of the talented photographer named Matthew Willman. It closes on February 19th, and if you have not seen it, I do recommend that you do take the time. It's poignant, it's powerful, and it's truly worth your time. So please do come back to see that. I also want to thank, and I didn't do this before and I should have, thank our volunteers and all of our Clinton Center members. Without your support, without your help, we could not put on programs like these. So we truly appreciate it. It's also my privilege to introduce the lovely and intriguing Zelda Grange. Zelda was born in South Africa in 1970, so she grew up in the segregated South Africa. And she admits she actually supported the rules of the apartheid. Her family, her conservative family, even referred to the then imprisoned president, or Nelson Mandela at that time, as a terrorist. Yet, a few years later, when he was released in 1990, she found herself traveling the world by his side. She dedicated over 19 years of her life to him. She became his personal aide, his confidant, his close friend. And she loved every single bit of it. This man, where her conservative family once called a terrorist, would become the man she called Kulu, which means grandfather. She now travels all over telling her remarkable story and talking about her remarkable experiences to people. She does that personally through public speaking, and she writes, and she is the author of the book called Good Morning, Mr. Mandela, a memoir. And tonight, directly following the program, she will be available to sign that book, and it is fascinating. If you have not purchased that book, I recommend you do that as well. It is available downstairs in the Clinton Museum store. And if you're a Clinton Center member, you even get a discount. So please do that. She is here tonight. Please help me welcome Miss Zelda Grange.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Lina, thank you very, very much. I was getting all emotional with that introduction. You do it with so much grace and passion. Even my own stories start sounding attractive to me. Thank you very much, Anyana, and everyone at the Clinton Center, also the volunteers. Thank you very much for all the work that's gone into not only my visit, but also the exhibition here. It was very moving for me to walk through the exhibition this morning, also being at the Clinton Library. As you know, Mr. Mandela and President Clinton shared a very warm friendship. And I think those years, I'm talking 1997, around 1997, I think they discovered what the word bromance would mean. It was really a warm friendship, and one based on mutual respect between two great leaders of our times. I'm here to share with you how I came to be serving this man for 19 years, what happened in my life, where I come from. And through my story, you'll realize that there is such a thing as Ubuntu. Ubuntu means what connects us as human beings, not what sets us apart, but what connects us. At a beautiful speech President Clinton made at the Nelson Mandela Foundation a few years ago, he pointed out that our DNA suggests that all of us in this room has 99% similarity according to our DNA. So 1% sets us apart, according to scientists, that's what they say. So the 1% is what I look like, the color of my skin, my appearance mainly. Why do we choose on connecting or focusing on the 1% rather than the 99% that binds us all? Why do we choose to focus on the differences? And the lives of these two gentlemen, both Nelson Mandela and President Bill Clinton, really showed us what it is like to choose humanity over ideology. That's what it's all about. And my story and sharing a bit of my story will bring you to understand that better. To do justice to the whole story and my experience, I have to start at the beginning. I was born in 1970, as you heard, in apartheid South Africa. Many of you will remember where you were in 1970. I was born in a society that lived by segregation. It was law to live in apartheid, and on every level of society, we got indoctrinated by propaganda daily, through the churches, through our school or education system. So even my religion dictated that I was in support of apartheid. The Dutch Reformed Church approved of apartheid, so my religion was implicated. The school system, the media was controlled by the apartheid regime, and the propaganda was fed to us on every level of society daily. So what happened in 1970? Where were we in 1970? The Nixon administration bombed Cambodia. Americans and the world protest the continued war in Vietnam. You'll remember those years. The Beatles released their final single, and that's when Paul McCartney announced his departure from the group and led to the breakup of the Beatles. Apollo 13 crashed into the Pacific Ocean. The Boeing 747 made its first flight across the Atlantic. Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin died in 1970. The first New York City marathon was run, and Nelson Mandela turned 52 in 1970, the year I was born, and it was his 6th year in prison when I was born. And South Africa spent its 22nd year of apartheid rule in 1970. So I was born well into apartheid. Many of you know the history of my country, and just to give you a few images of what apartheid really looked like. People were on beaches, there was a white area and a black area. You were expected to go to a beach, but swim in the same sea, but go to a separate beach because of the color of your skin. Bus stops were different. Water tanks, where people fetched water or just used ablution facilities were different. The only relationship I knew as a child with a black person, and this is not my photo, these photos are taken from the internet, but I remember growing up that my lifeline was the domestic worker that brought me up, that looked after me, that clothed me, that gave me food. And in the South African context, they were all black people. And my life depended on this lady in my family. But I couldn't understand what apartheid was about. She was okay in my house, but not in society. In society, my behavior was dictated by what I was fed every day. So in most Afrikaner families, we were brought up by black domestic workers, and the only relationship you knew was the one of the domestic servant and you being the employer or the master. Black people had to carry passbooks. The passbook would really restrict them from moving outside the area where they were licensed to work or to move in South Africa. This is the kind of sanitation facilities black people were subjected to. How do you, without, there's no toilet door. And even today, in many communities, it still looks like this. How do you build a child's dignity? A child that needs to go to toilet like this. It is unthinkable now, if you look at it. This is the informal settlement, one of the informal settlements where black people are expected to get fresh water from. And that is a picture, aerial photo of what the segregation was all about, the Groups Area Act. On the left-hand side, the informal settlement where black people lived, and just across the street, where there's proper housing and proper facilities, sanitation, water, electricity, would be the white area. Sadly, it still looks like that in South Africa, or a lot of communities still look like that. Informal trading, this is how people traded in the apartheid years. No interracial marriages were allowed by law in those years. So Nelson Mandela and his friends, his political friends from the African National Congress, launched a defiance campaign in 1952, opposing these laws. And for doing that, Mr. Mandela was sentenced to jail, to life imprisonment on this island off the coast of Cape Town in South Africa. It's like your Alcatraz. He was supposed to spend his life, the rest of his life there, but then after 18 years on this island, he started negotiating with the apartheid government, and he then they moved him to Polsmoor prison on the main island, and later to Victor Verster, where he was released from. But 18 of the 27 years of his imprisonment he spent on this island. And in this exhibition up here, you'll see a beautiful reconstruction of the cell in which he was kept. Now, to put that more in context, Cape Town also enjoys a winter rainfall. However, if you are stuck in a little cell, I explained this morning to the students that if you put football being fresh on your memory since last night, if you take footballs and you place them next to one another, if you take 88 footballs, that would be the size of Mr. Mandela's cell. 18 years he would spend in that cell. And winter in, winter out. And it rained, and it's cement floors, one blanket, no bed to sleep on, just a bucket in which to do your private business at night while the cell is locked. 18 years he spent like that. This is the lime quarry on Robben Island, where they used to just cut up rocks for no good reason. I asked Mr. Mandela, what was the purpose of this? And he said to me, there was no purpose. It was just to keep the prisoners busy. That was his cell. That bucket on the left-hand side is what he used as his toilet every night. So you would expect a person coming from these circumstances after 18 years and then 27 years in prison, you would expect that person to be bitter. You would expect him to be resentful. Yet there was nothing. There was really nothing. There was no hatred. There was no bitterness. And to me, it was a miracle seeing this man and realizing what he's been through. It was really a miracle that the only thing he had for the people around him, even the people like me who represented the previous regime, he only had love. So he was freed on the 11th of February 1990. This coming weekend, right, is the anniversary. Walked a free man, and South Africa had the first democratically elected elections or democratic elections in 1994. People queued like this all over South Africa to cast their first votes. You must remember in South Africa in apartheid, black people were not, their births were not registered and their deaths were not registered. And then I say to people, imagine your father or your mother's death or birth was not registered. Imagine you didn't even count as much that your birth was registered. The government couldn't care less about your existence. Why register you? So freedom and the liberation movement in South Africa really brought about dignity to black people in South Africa. But my family were supporters of apartheid, and when you grow up in privilege like I did, simply because of the color of my skin, you didn't ask questions about what was happening outside the borders of your community. My parents both had jobs. We had a stable, good household. My parents took us on holidays 3 times a year. I had a fairly good education. Why would I worry about what happens outside the borders of my community? Why would I worry about oppression of other people? And slowly you start being swept away by this propaganda and the indoctrination that followed through the media and the church every day, and we became supporters. We weren't politically active, but we became supporters of apartheid. And I now say to people, and much to my peers in my country, much to their disgust, I say to people, if you support a system without standing up and questioning it, by default, you become part of that system. I didn't speak up. I didn't ask questions. There's no one to blame but myself. And in my book, my memoir, Good Morning, Mr. Mandela, I admit to being a racist. I was a proper racist because by default, I supported a system that approved of racism, just by the way I lived my life. So you can't imagine that I would then end up working for Nelson Mandela. Somehow it happened, and if you don't believe in fate, then my story is something to convince you otherwise. I started working in Mr. Mandela's office in 1994 after he became president. About 2 weeks into the job, I was being the most junior person in his office. We were only 5 people in his private staff, and I was the most junior person. I never thought at the age of 23 that I would have to meet the president. You think if you accept a job in the president's office that you would be a huge contingent of personnel, 200 people, never thinking that I would be put on the spot to meet this man, which my people called the enemy. 2 weeks into the job, I walk into his private secretary's office, Mr. Mandela's private secretary, and I nearly bumped into this group of people exiting her office. And I noticed this man in front of me, the president, the newly elected president of South Africa, the man we call the terrorist. And immediately I went into shock, not knowing what to expect. And I thought I would be held responsible now for my belief system, and I have to, you don't know what to do. And I noticed he was surrounded by bodyguards, all men dressed in dark suits, wearing sunglasses indoors, and you realize this is the stereotype bodyguard. And I felt like running away. I became scared, and I realized these men around him are all armed guards, and I thought, well, I'm in danger now. And then Mr. Mandela extended his hand to me, and he smiled, and the first thing you noticed when you met him was the sincerity in his eyes, that kindness on his face, that infectious smile of his. And he waited for me to reciprocate. Not knowing what to do, I thought, well, I have to shake hands with him, so I did. And he held my hand into a firm grip throughout the conversation. He started speaking to me, and I realized I didn't understand what he was saying. So I had to say, pardon me, sir, excuse me, Mr. President, could you repeat yourself? And when he repeated himself, I realized he was speaking to me in my home language, Afrikaans, the language of the oppressor, the people who sent him to prison. And it's not that his Afrikaans wasn't good. It's that the last thing my brain expected was that this man would speak to me in the language of the oppressor, the people who denied him much of his life. And I became all emotional, and I realized, he said over the years actually, that when you speak to a man, you speak to his head. But when you speak to a man in his language, you speak to his heart. And that's what he did that day. He just destroyed my defenses immediately, and he opened me up to just having that first conversation. And you know what women do in a situation like that? We become all emotional, and then I started crying. So now the tears are rolling down my face, and he's holding onto my hand, and he's asking about my upbringing and where I came from. And then he put his other hand on my shoulder, and he said, no, relax, you are overreacting. Because he saw me crying. Trust me, when a president tells you you're overreacting, you compose yourself. And I did, and that day really started the rest of my life. It changed my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. I felt guilty, first of all. I felt responsible. And I thought, how do I correct this? How do I give him back 27 years? I can't. I just can't do that. But what I can do is I can commit to my job. I can dedicate my life. I can devote myself to this job, this junior position in his office, and just show him that, some of us are willing to work towards the new South Africa. Of course, I started reading about the history of my own country only then, at the age of 23. Then one day, President Mandela called me into his office. As you see, I was a young girl once. Um, Called me into his office and he asked me to sit down, and I thought I was in trouble of some kind because the president wouldn't usually ask the junior staff member to sit down in his office. And when I sat down, he looked at me and he said, "Now, I want you to travel to Japan with me." And the first thing that came to mind was, this is very inappropriate. I thought, this cannot happen. I need to get out of this as fast as possible because I'm not going to Japan with him. And now, I was not even working for him for a year, and I didn't know what to expect. I never left the borders of my own country. Why would I be going to Japan now? And I started thinking of excuses, how to get out of this, and the only thing, the stupidest thing that you can think of to say to someone like that, that's just presenting you this opportunity, I said to Mr. Mandela, "I'm sorry, Mr. President, but I don't have money to go to Japan right now." So he burst out laughing, and he saw that I was quite serious, and he said, he added some information I needed, and he said, "I need you to be on my delegation, part of my delegation, and we are going on a state visit to Japan." Some critical information I needed the first round. I find myself going to Japan, and when we were introduced, the delegation was introduced to the emperor in Japan. When Mr. Mandela got to me, he introduced me to the emperor and he said, "This is Zelda. The South Africans make that strange sound in our surnames." And he said, "This is Zelda." And I saw the emperor was puzzled by that pronunciation. And Mr. Mandela said, "And she's a real Afrikaner, a boeremeisie," which describes my people, and, farm girl is the direct translation. My people were known as farmers, or they still are known as farmers. We work the land. And of course, the emperor had no clue what that meant. But what Mr. Mandela was telling him and the world was that even the people who represented the former regime, the regime of oppression, the regime of segregation, even those people were going to be welcome in the new South Africa, as long as you were willing to subscribe to the ideals of this country that he was trying to build. And I realized then it was a calling, and that was the only thing I could do within my power, was really to show the world that I was part of this future, the Ubuntu that he stood for. And that's how I ended up working with Mr. Mandela for 19 years. Of course, when he retired in 1999, he could pick one person from his office to remain with him in retirement. And I was very honored to be picked by him to serve him beyond retirement. Subsequently, I worked with him for 19 years, and he became more like a grandfather to me. I try and explain to people, they say, "How much time did you spend with him?" And I try to explain to them, 19 years, you bring a child into this world. After 6, 7 years, if you're lucky, you send that child off to school every day. So at least for 5, 6, 7, 8 hours, you are away from that child for the rest, for 12 years to come. I never went away for the 8, 9 hours. I spent every single day of a good side of, I would say, 16 of the 19 years, every single day with Mr. Mandela. We traveled the world, and that's how I became to meet the Clintons, of course, and also foster a warm friendship with them. I was very honored, and I often asked myself, why me? I was not deserving of this. But he wanted to show and continue to show the world that it's not the ideals of this democracy, of this representation of all South Africa's people, was not only an ideal he was selling, but it was an arrangement he was willing to make even in his most inner circle. And then developed this grandfather-granddaughter relationship. And I served Mr. Mandela until his death in 2013. As you know, Mr. Mandela united the entire country when he arrived at the Rugby World Cup, similar to the Super Bowl last night, but the Rugby World Cup was very much seen as an Afrikaans sport and a sport of the white people. And on the final of the Rugby World Cup in 1995, Mr. Mandela arrived with the colors of the Springboks being our national rugby team, the green jersey, the green cap, and he just united all the people across South Africa, across races, religion, ideology, all of them. We were like one man behind our national team, and we won. People often ask me, what are the important lessons I've learned, the lessons that stand out? And I just want to highlight a few by telling a few anecdotes to you. The first is really Mr. Mandela's ability, or what made him such an authentic leader, was his ability to listen to people, to listen to them, and also to try and understand where they come from, even when it came to the enemy. If you read The Long Walk to Freedom, you'll notice that Mr. Mandela's first memory, his first childhood memory, was when he attended meetings of the elders in his own community. And he noted then in the book that he realized that they all had an opportunity to speak. And the function of the head of the family was really to listen to each and everyone, and at the end of the conversation, present to the audience a very balanced view of what people said during the discussion. And Mr. Mandela had this ability to really listen to everyone, to understand where they came from, even the enemy, even if it means the people you do not agree with. I said to the group this morning, the students this morning, we live now in a time of smartphones and stupid people. It's the age of instant gratification. We all want to respond before we think. We don't even hear what the other person is trying to say because our response has to be smarter. So we lose each other through, social media. We don't listen to each other anymore. And Mr. Mandela had this ability to listen to people with the intention of trying to understand them, rather than the intention that drove him to respond. He didn't really want to respond all the time. He just wanted to listen, to try and understand where even the enemy came from. The second lesson is about discipline. I'm sure if you follow world politics, you'll know of the overthrow recently of our neighboring country's president, Robert Mugabe, the president of Zimbabwe, after 30 years of rule. He was recently unseated, let's call it that. It was a smart coup, that's how Africans call it. There was no violence and so on. But Mr. Mandela, in 1998, actually reprimanded President Robert Mugabe publicly for being late for a meeting once. It was a big plenary session, about 1,000 people at the regional heads of state meeting, and President Mugabe sneaked in at the back about an hour late. President Mandela brought the entire proceeding to a standstill, and he launched into a speech of about 20 minutes, telling people how disrespectful it was to be late, without mentioning President Mugabe's name once. Of course, we all knew who he was speaking about. And this is our neighboring country. It's a strategic country for South Africa. That was the last day there was any contact between Mr. Mandela and President Mugabe. Mr. Mandela was willing to sacrifice that relationship, but he was not going to tolerate someone that's not punctual, someone who didn't show discipline, because he believed it is just a sign of disrespect for another person's time if you are late. So in South Africa, we've got this thing now where people call each other, they say, oh, I'm going to be late, but it's African time. And then I say, there's no such thing as African time. The number one African taught me that it's just a sign of disrespect if you are late. That was how Mr. Mandela felt about discipline. He was an authentic leader because he practiced by this. He showed us every day what he was all about. In these anecdotes I share with you, you'll really realize that that is what authentic leadership is all about. The second lesson is about respect. Now, Mr. Mandela was challenged to court in 1998 as president of the country after he established a commission of inquiry into sports affairs. Mr. Mandela's counsel tried to persuade him not to go to court, and they said the president would be humiliated if he appeared in court personally. And they tried to persuade him not to go, not to appear, and they said, we will go and defend you. Mr. Mandela insisted, and he said he will go and defend his own decisions in court. On the first day of our appearance in court, He walks up to the opposition lawyers first and he greets them in the morning, speaks to them all in Afrikaans, of course, their home language as well. He speaks to them. And I was very upset and I wanted, at tea time, I wanted to make a big scene. And I said, Mr. President, did you realize you greeted the opposition first before you greeted your own lawyers? You know, these people have the audacity to challenge your authority as president. Why did you greet them? And he told me two of the most important things I ever heard him say. And the first is, the way you approach a person will determine how that person treats you. Because he approached the opposition council with respect, they had no option but to deal with him, to reciprocate with respect. And the second thing he said was, you never allow the enemy to determine the grounds for battle. What he wanted to show me that day, or show everyone that day, was this is a matter before the law, matter in court. We'll deal with it in accordance to the law. There's no need to make it a personal battle. And by doing that, by reaching out to the opposition, he neutralized the courtroom, and emotionally, the battle was already halfway won. So that was about respect. And you know, people often ask me, what was it about Nelson Mandela? Because he has vices and virtues like all of us. What was it about him that made him such a special person? And then I say to them, it's this thing of respect. Being able to strip a person off the layers, it's like an onion until you are only left with the core of that person. And that is what Ubuntu is all about. It's connecting humanity. It's the humanity connecting in people. Whether you were a president or a protocol officer or security guard or a CEO or a minister or a religious leader or whatever, he dealt with people across the board with the same respect. And that is what made the man so revered, the fact that he could acknowledge a person's humanity above ideology or what set us apart. Then another lesson is about integrity and ethics. If you follow South African news, you'll see that morally in South Africa we are in crisis. We have a leadership vacuum at the moment because of the corruption in our country. And it set us a few years back in terms of progressing, and also have said about the corruption, the level of corruption in South Africa. And then I tell them this very simple story of my experiences where Mr. Mandela's integrity and his ethics and his moral values, all of that just are explained so beautifully. We were in Kuwait City once, and what we did when we traveled to a foreign country is we would take 5 South African bodyguards with us. It was only myself and the doctor and then 5 security officials. And when we went to see the emir or the head of state in the foreign country, we would leave 2 of our own security guards behind to guard our rooms and our belongings. And in this case, we did the same in Kuwait City. And upon our return after midnight, that night to the hotel, there was war suddenly. Meaning, you know, it's a metaphor now, but Mr. Mandela called me to his room, and he was very angry when I met him in his room, and he said, call the Commissioner of Police. And I said, it's after midnight, why are we calling the Commissioner of Police? Mr. Mandela then said, someone stole something in my bathroom. I said, well, what did they steal? I expected the answer to be, I hope it's the bathtub or the mirror or something big, because this is a big issue. If you are going to wake up the Commissioner of Police at midnight, it has to be a big issue, right? So I said, what was stolen? Please help me, is there something I can do? And he said, I don't know what it is. It's probably a bar of soap. And I thought, no, can't have you call the Commissioner of Police, who was also the head of Interpol those years. I can't have you wake this man for a bar of soap. And I said, well, how do you know something was stolen? And he then said, I counted each and every item in my bathroom before we went to the meeting, and now there's something gone. And I want all of my bodyguards fired immediately. And I thought, well, how do the doctor and how do we get him home if everyone is fired? I can't allow that to happen. And I tried to calm him down, and I said, well, we can't call now because it's of the late hour, but in the morning we'll try and resolve it. Mr. Mandela was a lawyer by training, and that night I saw him become a prosecutor in Kuwait. He called all his security guards into the hotel room, he turned the room into a courtroom, a proper courtroom. He made them stand parade. He interrogated them for about 20 minutes, asking who stole the item from his bathroom. And it sounded like a simple issue, but he was going to have all of them fired, and he said to them, if you replace the item tonight while we are asleep, I won't have all of you fired, but otherwise tomorrow morning you are all gone. And those of us who knew Nelson Mandela knew that he was very serious. They would all be fired the next morning. So what do you think happened? The person replaced the item that night while we were asleep. And the next morning he forgave and forgot immediately. I'm not telling you the story because of all of this drama and so on. The reason I'm telling you the story is we left the hotel that morning to return home or wherever we were going. And you know what? Mr. Mandela didn't take any of the items in his bathroom. He didn't touch it. The toiletries, this was, of course, in Kuwait City with all the oil money. They tried to impress him. They tried to spoil him with, a huge variety of toiletries. He didn't take anything. He didn't open it. He was very adamant that he wanted to leave a message to his host to say, thank you for your hospitality, but I don't need to take advantage of you because you are so wealthy. I don't need to take any of these toiletries. I want to respect that this is yours, and I want to respect the fact that we are friends and it's not about the money and it's not about you spoiling me. If this story doesn't tell you anything about the man's integrity, his ethics, how he viewed honesty versus dishonesty, then there's nothing else that will convince you. So when you ask me what he would have said about corruption, I tell people this story. However, in South Africa, we also, we found ways to bypass the law in our everyday lives. We have this thing, we bribe cops. So you get caught for drinking and driving, and you just slip the cop a 200 Rand note, which is about $20. You slip the $20 and you don't get arrested, so you don't have a criminal record. And the cops, on the other hand, because they are so poorly paid, they accept the bribe. And it's all forgiven and forgotten. Now, people ask me what Mr. Mandela would say about corruption, and then I say to them, well, you bribe cops. Why do you ask me what he would have said about corruption? So we have dropped the moral bar in South Africa. And when people then try and look for solutions by speaking to me, I then leave them with the last lesson that I've learned from Mr. Mandela, and that is about change. I explained to you earlier the size of the cell. I explained to you that he really started loving me like his own, like his granddaughter. There was no resentment, not a crack of bitterness. At some point, I was actually desperate for him to be angry at someone. I said, it's fine, be angry at me. I take responsibility for what we did to you. Just be angry. It's unnatural for you not to be angry. And then he would look at me and even love me just more. And he then once said to me, it's easier to change others than it is to change yourself. And I realized that in prison, he had to really sit and work at himself and not be bitter and not be full of hatred and resentment. And he realized that he could only influence other people if he had changed himself first and got rid of the anger. You cannot preach something that you are not willing to live by yourself. So that is the biggest lesson for me of Nelson Mandela, is that it's easier to change others. So I can stand here and I can tell you about ethics and about respect and discipline, but not unless I live my life in a way that really enhances these things that Mr. Mandela spoke about. And you all know that beautiful quote, that freedom, quote from Mr. Mandela, freedom is not merely to cast off one's chains. It's really to live your life in a way that enhances the freedoms of other people. And it's the 100th anniversary of Mr. Mandela's birthday this year. And I go around the world and I try and inspire people and I try and call on them. You have similar issues in the USA at the moment, dealing with what I will call a leadership crisis. And we have similar, okay, I didn't say anything strange, I just called it a leadership crisis. But I have a pin. I miss Bill, okay? um, but just to say to you that these are universal problems. I find them everywhere where I go, where I travel. And, you know, the solutions, we all know the solutions. We all have had the privilege of living in the times of people like Nelson Mandela and Bill Clinton. How can we not learn from history? Slowly, if you view the world's problems, we are slowly moving back to our old behaviors. And how do we stop that? By really keeping the legacies of these people alive. So I want to call on you. It's the centenary celebrations of Mr. Mandela this year. Please help us, South Africans, but also yourselves. He was a universal citizen, and help us to reinvigorate these values and the morals and so on that he stood for, and that people like Bill Clinton supported in him. The last quote I want to leave to you is this one of just absolute love from Mr. Mandela, and it is my favorite quote. No person is born hating another person because of the color of your skin, your background, or your religion. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. Because love comes more natural to the human heart than its opposite. And we all know that when a baby is born, there's no hatred, there's no discrimination. We create that. And it is our responsibility as this generation to ensure that we only create love for the next generation. I want to thank you all again for being here tonight and listening to my story. I would have welcome if we actually have a few questions from the audience, and I'm happy to answer. Thank you very much again for being here. There's two roaming mics. So, ma'am, this gentleman here. Oh, he's first. And there's one in the front row as well. So.
First of all, welcome. We're glad to have you in Central Arkansas. Is this working? My name is Patrick Hayes. I had the opportunity to serve as mayor of North Little Rock for a long time, which is our city on the north side. And I also had the opportunity to go to South Africa in '93 with a group of mayors, and can tell you that the country is beautiful, and certainly the people are hospitable. And it was really in the early days of change that took place. Prior to his release, I know on an international stage, Winnie Mandela occupied a very prominent role. But it seemed like after he left, of course, that relationship faltered, and ultimately I think there was a divorce. Can you comment on her as a part of his life, and what role that you might have had personally in understanding that or being a part of that?
Sure, sir. Thank you. When I started working for Mr. Mandela in 1994, he was already separated from her. And I try and explain to people, because they find it strange, that I probably saw about 10 times in my life. There's no relationship really between us. To explain to you that, I try and explain to people that when you go into a new job, you don't necessarily befriend your boss's ex-wife. At that point, Mr. Mandela also didn't have the relationship with his last wife, so I met him as a single man, and he was pretty much just caught up in work all day, and I was then in the unfortunate position to be the one calling the ex-wife and then giving instructions. So there was never any love lost between us. Unfortunately, people only also see the side that the public portray of Winnie Mandela, but Mr. Mandela's last wife, Mrs. Graça Machel, brought me to realize that if it was not for Winnie Mandela during Mr. Mandela's imprisonment, she was the person that he dreamt about. She was the person that really kept his mind alive for 27 years. And even if you don't appreciate, and I don't condone the things that she may have been involved in, careful choice of words there, but you may not agree with her, but you have to give her the credit for keeping the man's spirit alive. And because of her, I had the opportunity to work for the boss that I worked for, because she had a role in history. She really kept the struggle alive through his incarceration. So for that, I give her credit and I give her the respect. But because of the timing and when I came into Mr. Mandela's life, there was not really ever a relationship. I do, however, enjoy a relationship with especially her youngest daughter. It's one of the children I'm very close to.
I'll give it to Ann. Here you go.
Thank you, Pat. I'm glad you raised the question. I met that man that you described at Bill Clinton's inaugural as the special guest, Rosa Parks, Daisy Bates, and myself. And when I looked in the audience like I'm looking tonight and see who's here, and I noticed him in the audience, I got up after arguing a little bit with Daisy and Rosie to say, why is he sitting back there as anonymous, this wonderful man, and we're sitting on the front row? Rosie, like she always was, says, Anna, we ain't got nothing to do with that. Daisy said, don't start nothing. So I said, I'm not going to start nothing, but I'm going back here. And so I went back there to speak to him, and I told him my concern. And I told him I thought I was fortified and authorized to confront him about being anonymous in the audience. I told him I was on the national board of the YWCA, the World YWCA, as a delegate to the UN. And it was when I asked Mary Rockefeller to make the motion and Eunice Shriver to second the motion that we, the YWCA of USA, would send for Winnie to come be our speaker, because we had a moral obligation to stand by this woman and these two little girls. It happened. She came. I shared that with him. And then I shared with him that at the first inaugural national holiday for Martin Luther King, who they were to me Siamese twins in their integrity, his daughters were there to sell bracelets, freedom bracelets, to try to finish apartheid. And I shared that with him. But I saw that human part of him that you knew, I know you know it. And I told him I bought it for the 22 children I had brought to Atlanta for the first Martin Luther King holiday. And I didn't have enough extra money to pay for the 22 children from Little Rock freedom bracelets to finish apartheid's demolishment. And he said, I said, so I feel like I can say to you what I need to say. Why are you not on the stage with Bill Clinton? I said, there's Clarence Thomas sitting up there. You deserve to be up there more than Clarence does. And he patted me on my shoulder. He said, that's all right. He said, for you to even be concerned about me getting some notoriety as a leader, I don't deserve that. Thank you for what you did for Winnie. Thank you for what you did for my children. But you just keep on doing what you feel in your heart is the right thing. So I came to see how blessed you were to be selected to be his companion in his work. So thank you and welcome to this building that's so special to me. And I was in my last part when I looked and saw Bill and Hillary sitting on the stage at his funeral in his little hometown. So thank you. You have finished the circle for me.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. I actually, there was no question, but I do want to respond if you'll allow me, ma'am. I actually also said to the students this morning that One of the things that Mr. Mandela taught me is that you don't have to have a position to be able to change the world, or to make a difference in the world. And I said, you know, we had this conversations about politics today and politicians today, and it's not politicians, and I repeat this almost every day as I do my public speaking, it's not politicians that change the world. It took a woman to refuse to get off a bus that changed the course of this country's history. It took a group of women in South Africa to march to the Union buildings in 1956, black women in defiance of the pass law that changed the history of our country. It was not the politicians, it was not the names that we now put to great events, and with all due respect to them, it is women, it's ordinary people. So I want to say to you, thank you for just sharing that day with Mr. Mandela, sharing that thought to us, but also you mentioned Rosa Parks. I speak about her every single day of my life, and someone I haven't met. So I greatly admire you being next to her and acknowledging her. So I want to say that to you, just to you. Thank you. Thanks.
Did your anti-apartheid epiphany affect your relationship with your friends and family? Because they were probably still pro-apartheid.
Yes, sir, and still to this day, you outgrow people because of, ideology and so on, I think. And I was quite impatient with people in my own community because I was changing at a very fast pace and coming to realize what really happened in my country. And I was expecting other people to do the same, people around me to see, but yet they didn't live my experiences. And when I one day asked Mr. Mandela about it or expressed my frustration with him, he urged me to leave people, to leave other people, and he said to me, if you force someone to change at your pace, it means that it's not authentic, it's not real change. You must allow a person to go through his own experiences and allow that person to change at his own pace, because that way you'll know that it's for real. And in our community, in my parents, where we lived, my parents were ostracized to a great extent after a documentary was viewed on the national broadcaster one night, and it appeared where I was serving tea in Mr. Mandela's office. And people were saying, the white people were saying, we can't be friends with the Lagrancies because their daughter serves tea to a black man. And that was very hurtful to my parents. But that is part of the greatness of Nelson Mandela, or was part of the greatness. These people that made these comments showed up at one of my speeches one night about 4 years ago. I noticed them in the audience, and I told my stories as I usually did. I didn't tell this story though. And afterwards, they came to me. They knew, that this is the only thing I can speak of. It's my life experiences, and they knew that it would include Nelson Mandela. And they came afterwards and didn't say a word, just gave me a hug. And I thought he changed them as well. So that is the greatness of the man, or was the greatness. He had this ripple effect. It didn't only change my life, but through my life, it had this ripple effect, and it changed thousands and thousands of people. Anyone else? Ma'am, you've been waiting so long for that question.
I have a question for you, but I wanted to make a little statement. Because of South African Airways vacation, we're going back to the continent of Africa for the fourth time.
Sure.
And I apologize for what our current president said about the continent. It couldn't be more untrue. Not... It's not just the countryside, which is beautiful and amazing, and the animals, which I love. And I'm hoping to support ecotourism by going to photograph and look at the animals and hopefully preserve their habitat, because it's shrinking like it is all over the world. But the most important thing are the people of the continent. And I keep asking them, why are you so happy you don't hear people complain, and there are problems, and I know I'm a tourist, and we see all the good things, and we talk to a lot of blacks. There are guides, there are drivers, there are the rangers, and I keep quizzing them. Do you complain at home? And they say pretty much they're happy with what they have, and they wake up and they don't know what's going to happen that day. So they're happy, and it comes from inside. It's not superficial. And then you get back to the waiting area to get back on the plane, to come back to the States, and then you'll hear
The whining.
the complaint, yes. But in South African Airways has really made it affordable to fly directly to Johannesburg and their travel agents, because it's been, the cost has come down so much, so I'm advertising for them. But the second thing, would you explain to, I'm not sure they understand how they classify people in South Africa, what it means to be colored, what it means to be Afrikaan, and what it means to be white. And I found out talking to our guides that it was very acceptable to ask a black person what tribe they come from.
Yes. Sure, ma'am. Yes, you know, the resilience of the South African people, you know, we all realized after 1994, well, 1990 to 1994, we could have had a civil war. And Mr. Mandela brought South Africans to understand that we all had a part in that peaceful transition. It would have taken one irresponsible person to pull a gun, and we could have burnt that country to the ground. But we all decided that what is better for the country is, you know, let's take the leadership from our leaders who happen to be politicians. Of course, I don't think Mr. Mandela was a politician, he was a humanitarian more. But you know, we all played a part in that. So the resilience of the South African people is what saved us, and we can only hope that that will continue. In South Africa, you are classified, of course, we've got a very diverse society. Just to bring in a bit of history, the first people that really were part of the land in South Africa is called the Khoisan and the Khoi and the San. It was what we refer, Afrikaner people or Dutch people rather, refer to them as Bushmen, which is quite unacceptable these days to use. Because it would mean that you talk about a person that lives in the bush. It's not that they, you know, live in the bush. They choose to be hunters by profession and very how do you say, a survival skill of another kind is the Bushmen, as we refer to them. But that's the Khoi and the San and the Khoisan. It's different, and the Twa is also a very small community. They were the first people that we call as, they were native to Africa. And then from the northern side of Africa came the Ngunis, the black people, as we call them. In South Africa, though, you have many tribes. You have the Zulu-speaking people who came from one region of Africa. Then you have the Xhosa-speaking people. Mr. Mandela was a Xhosa. You have the Venda, you have the Pedi, Tswana. There's so many of them, the Motswana. So there's all these different, it's not clans, but these different tribes of African people. And then within that, you have tribal parts as well. So Mr. Mandela was part of the Madiba family, and it's his clan name. He was part of the Madiba clan. But then there's the Galekas, who is also in the Tembu tribe. So it's very complicated. I cannot even begin to try and explain to you the intricacies of all of that. But, you know, that's the black people. As I say, we have 11 official languages, of which Afrikaans and English are 2. Then you get the brown people. The brown people are closer to the Khoi and the San, although when the Dutch and the French Huguenots, of which I'm a descendant, When they came to Africa, they brought slavery, of course, and there was always this interracial relationships which were not allowed in those days, but they secretly happened. So even the white people now in South Africa have Khoisan blood. I mean, we do this DNA testing, and much to the conservatives' disgust, we all have Khoisan blood, and I'm quite proud of my Khoisan heritage. But so just to explain to you, we are mixed races in South Africa, and during apartheid, people were classified. You were either white or you were non-white. The non-white was colored, Indian, black. So it's not as simple as black and white in South Africa. It's all of that, trying to deal with all of that. It's very, very complicated. And then, of course, with the white people, you've got Afrikaans and English people. Afrikaans people being the Dutch descendants, and a mixture of German and the French and so on. And then you've got the English, which were the British. As you know, South Africa was colonized by the British people as well. So it's not just black and white. It's definitely not. It's very, very complicated. And it's very sensitive also in South Africa. Although we can now, you know, I feel very comfortable asking a black person, are you Xhosa, or are you, and I've got an idea when I see someone's name, you know, from what tribe they may be. You can ask that, but, you know, it's hurtful when it's used in a derogatory way towards black people, and even white people are very sensitive, because you've got the Afrikaners. Most white people speak Afrikaans, and we are known as we were the farming community before, but farmers can also be used in a derogatory way. But I then explain to people, you know what? If you want to see racism in a chair, you'll find racism in a chair. It's how you see life and how you deal with it, and with the necessary respect and sensitivity, you can deal with a complex society like ours. This one.
Thanks. We're fortunate here in Little Rock to have the Presidential Center to have speakers like you to bring experiences to us. And listening to your story, I have a question for you. Coming from your background that you did and your heritage, and the President Mandela having such a small staff, how the heck did you get there?
That's why I say to you, sir, if you don't believe in fate, then my story should convince you otherwise. Yeah, I started you should, I'm not trying to sell my book, but it's detailed in my book. I was really the most junior person, and I really dedicated. I committed to this job. I had nothing else at that age. I had the energy as a 23-year-old. I was always first to answer the phone. And Mr. Mandela had an extremely fair mind when in dealing with anything around him. So he would be looking. He had this habit of calling people at 2 o'clock in the morning. So he would call the private secretary first, because she was the most senior in line, but she had a family. She had 2 children and a husband next to her that's asleep, so she's not going to answer the phone at 2 o'clock. Then he would call the other 2 people who were, you know, a bit older than me, but they also had families. They were not answering the phone. And the next person would be me. So I would be there. Yes, good morning, Mr. President. How can I help you? You know, get up, get ready, do anything, trace anyone in the world in 5 seconds, because I had no life. And it was also because of my guilt. You know, my people, I felt personally guilty and responsible for, as I got to know this man, realizing, you know, what we had done. And I felt, but what can I do in return? And I thought, all I can do is support him and serve him in the best way that I possibly could. And he noticed it. And if you answer the phone 50 times at 2 o'clock in the morning, that person keeps on calling.
Well, I told you she was fascinating. Thank you so much. We're going to let Zelda go ahead and go to the table to start getting ready to sign her book. And if you have any more questions, if you have a book, you can stand in line and have that signed and have some more conversation with her. But thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great night.